right, it's my pleasure to be interviewing somebody, that has been very inspirational in the affairs of Nigeria and in the affairs of society and in the advancement of learning and education in general, because he has constantly challenged the status quo. Your Highness, it's more than a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you.
I really appreciate talking to you. I just want to go straight to it today. And if you're just watching, this is the Rise News channel. I want to start by talking about, the need for personal convictions as regards societal change, with advocacy and, the United Nations. And congratulations on your work with the United Nations as regards, Goal 4 and 5. Where does this strong conviction come for the sense of advocacy as regards societal change?
Well, first of all, I think we all need to understand that as human beings, we're part of a wider society. And our happiness, our success, our prosperity will come to nothing if we do not ensure that the vast majority of those around us share in that prosperity and that success. Most societies that have attained stability, have attained peace and progress, have done that by lifting, in particular, the bottom of the pyramid. And I grew up in an environment where, for my parents, it was extremely important that I remember that leadership is first and foremost about serving people. Religiously, there's a conviction that if you're placed in a position of leadership, your worship of God in that position is bringing happiness to the people. So it's not so much about just showing piety or going to the mosque. It's about, if you are in a position of leadership, what have you done as gratitude to God by helping those who are less? Because there's nothing that tells you that you are a preferred child. I mean, God places you in that position for a purpose, and that purpose is to serve those whom He has not placed in that position. So for me, it was always about how do I express thanks for the privileges I've had in my life, the family I was born into, the opportunities I have had. How do I express thanks? By trying to give others that opportunity. And that's what I tell my children, and I'm hopeful that they will grow up with that sense of values. I remind my daughters that for each and every one of you who's just gotten a degree or a master's degree, there are hundreds of thousands of northern girls who have not even completed primary education, who have not completed secondary education, who are in forced marriages, who are living in abject poverty. And for me, if your education is something that only gives you a meal ticket, then it's a wasted investment. I need you to think about how each and every one of you can help those who are outside, and how you can create better opportunities for them, how you can help alleviate their circumstance, and how you can create a society that makes it possible for people who are not born into privilege to have access to the opportunities to rise out of the conditions that they find themselves in.
And that's very powerful. You were just saying just now, talking about, what you tell your daughters, that for every master's degree they have, there are all the, women out there that want to have that degree, but it can't because of some circumstance or the other. And that's going to segue into talking about what you have done for the girl child. You've done a lot, but the shocking thing is a lot of people don't know you've done a lot, as regards, pushing the advancement of the girl child. With what 1 million teachers have been doing. Can you just, tell us what you've been doing as regards that, the partnership with 1 million teachers and the advancement of the girl child, because you're really very passionate about this.
Yeah, I've always been passionate about the issue of the girl child and, in fact, the woman. And maybe later we'll probably even talk about women in banking and central bank and what we did with as far as gender empowerment is concerned. First of all, I come from a perspective that if you were to look for one single silver bullet that has the greatest potential upside impact on development, it is educating the girl child. It is educating the girl child that reduces infant mortality and maternal mortality, so it saves lives from the beginning. It improves nutrition in the children, because with education, they're able to give them better nutrition. It reduces poverty because they're not just an addition to the dependency ratio, but actually have an opportunity to begin to earn a living and to stand on their own feet. It breaks an intergenerational cycle of illiteracy and poverty. So it reduces fertility rates and therefore reduces the very fast rate of demographic growth, which has contributed to a lot of the social problems that we have. If you take Northern Nigeria, for example, with average fertility rates of 8 or 9 among girls who have not completed secondary education, down to 4 to 6 for those who've done secondary school education, and even less. So one of the reasons you continue to have poverty is that the rate of growth in the population outpaces the rate of growth in GDP. And this has led to all sorts of problems, from an increase in the number of out-of-school children to the levels of malnourishment, to the levels of infant mortality and maternal mortality, and so on. So this is part of what drives me to focus on SDG 5, on educating the girl child and also empowering all women and children. With 1 million teachers, what we're trying to do is focus on improving the quality of teachers, which is the foundation for improving the quality of education. And we are fortunate, I'm chairman of the advisory board, and we are fortunate to have the partnership of Queen's University in Canada. And with Queen's, we design training programs for teachers. These are online programs, and we have all sorts of them. We have a black belt program, for example, where teachers go from one stage to another. They go from a white belt cotton to black belt. Hopefully they'll go to white belt silk. And these are basically role models. They have high impact on their children. We improve their quality, but they also impact on the environment in which they are. And it is the work that we've done, and this all over Africa, is the success that we've done so far that encourages me now to launch this new initiative, which we will talk about, which is the SDG Challenge, which aims at basically providing equitable, fair, qualitative education to the underprivileged, and with particular emphasis on girls.
Let's talk about the SDG Challenge. Let's talk about the need to create that societal equilibrium at which, girls can have a pedestal to stand on and stand to aspire. Let's talk about that.
Okay, so the way it works, and this is something that's going to start this October. And what we would like to do is basically call for ideas. The first thing is to understand that for long we have tried bringing down ideas on education from the top. While teachers who live in communities probably have the best idea for how they can improve their education. So we've got some innovative teachers. So we want to empower the teachers. So the first thing to note is we're going to have a challenge that encourages teachers from all over the country, all over Africa, to come up with ideas for how education can be delivered cheaply, qualitatively, and equitably to the less privileged and especially rural girls. And these entries are going to be assessed by a team from Queen's University, and we're going to select winners. And once those winners are selected, we'll work with them to refine these ideas, to develop them, things like stakeholder engagement, things like project management, and so on. And then there will be an MS2 endowment fund. I hope to raise an endowment fund, invite my friends to fund these initiatives. So we select 10 ideas, and we try to use endowment fund to provide the funding for basically scaling these ideas up and delivering education to rural areas.
That's a very powerful and laudable initiative, and it's something to create a balance, but it's something that needs a level of sustainability. I mean, and how do you think around the sustainability and to make it live on?
The endowment fund, I think, is the key. And the fact that this is not going to be a one-off. So basically, even for the teachers, so the teachers will get a 1 million teacher scholarship, which allows them to have access to lifelong learning improvement opportunities. So they'll continue learning as curricula change, as technology changes. The teachers who win in this challenge are going to continue getting the best education from Queen's University to continue to upgrade their skills. So that's for them. Now the endowment fund, which will be run by a board of advisors with 1 Million Teachers Canada as the implementing partner, basically takes it away from me. I mean, I will attract the funding, and 1 Million Teachers will be implementing, and hopefully we'll get a number of parties who are interested in. I mean, you have a number of organizations, a number of individuals who are concerned about out-of-school children, a number of individuals who are concerned about girl-child education, and this is one way of pulling resources together from these organizations with a competent, established partnership with a university like Queen's, the Faculty of Education of Queen's University Canada, for implementation, to make sure that ideas that are tested are basically given scale and given the impetus. I think once we succeed, hopefully. We start this in October. By September, we have a closing dinner, and we launch the endowment fund within 1 year. Hopefully, by the time people see the impact of this, it will take on a life of its own.
Great one. I want to talk to you about your role as an SDG advocate and how challenging has it been. I mean, you gave a very spirited comment at the last United Nations session. And that was really very powerful about your role in, delivering goal 4 and 5 of SDG. And one thing that stood out for me in all of this is little did we know that we're going to have a pandemic that was going to change the world. I mean, both of us were not born in 1918, so we don't know how the last pandemic went in 1918 and all the pandemics. But this has changed the world. Economies of the world are falling, minus 20%. The British economy, Nigeria economies contracted 6%. It has thrown up a lot of things we don't even understand. They call it a new normal, but a lot of people don't see it as normal. It's abnormal. They can't crack it. So I want you to just make sense of this nonsense some people will say it is.
One of the best ways to really understand economics is to take your eye away from numbers and look at the human beings, or rather transcend the numbers and look at the human beings. So let me give you a simple example. So think of the Nigerian economy as one with a GDP of $250 billion. 1% of $250 billion, this is $2.5 billion. Okay? Multiply that by the exchange rate and divide that by, say, minimum wage of 30,000 naira. You immediately have like 5-10 million people that have been wiped out at the bottom of the pyramid. For every 1% drop in GDP, that is $2.5 billion worth of goods and services taken out, but that is $2.5 billion worth of income. Now that income could be profit, it could be rent, it could be wages. In Nigeria, most likely, it is wages. So you can easily see how many more people have been thrown into extreme poverty with a 6% drop in GDP. When you talk about inflation and people say, inflation has increased by 200 basis points. When you look at the consumer price index, the composite index, and you look at the breakdown, and you come to, for example, food crops, and you find that, and you go down and find that, for example, the price of gari cassava has gone up by 50%. Well, think of the millions of people who buy gari by the tin, who are no longer able to afford gari. What does that mean for them, for their families, for them as citizens? That could very well be the difference between a law-abiding and, yes, poor but contented neighbor and a criminal. So when you hear in a poor country, GDP dropped by 6%, it is massive. You and I may not feel that impact as much as the elite will feel the impact, those who are paying children's school fees abroad, those who are going abroad for medical expenses will see the impact in terms of the exchange rate and so on. But in terms of being able to eat, to feed your family, to educate your children, frankly, it may be a bit more difficult, but it's not good. It's not life and death. But for many people, that is the difference between life and death. It is what decides whether the child goes to school or has to come out and be hawking goods on the streets. It is what decides whether the father goes out every morning to his place of work or whether he sits at home doing nothing and has to go into crime in order to feed his family. So, and the problem, of course, is that in this country we've had, I know it's now a term that people have associated with death, but we've had pre-existing conditions. When you talk about COVID, you talk about people with pre-existing conditions who are vulnerable to death. Our economy already had pre-existing conditions. The rate of growth before COVID hit was just about 2%. Now compared to the 2016 crisis, where on the eve of that crisis, growth was anything between 5 and 7%. So we already were in slow growth mode. We already were spending 60-70% of government revenue on debt service. We already had a low level of reserves compared to imports. We already had multiple exchange rates. We had already spent 5-6 years and continued paying over 1 trillion naira in fuel subsidy. We already did not have transparency in NNPC. So we already were set up precisely not to be able to cope with an unexpected crisis, which is why the only option before the government is to go and raise more money and go and borrow, because the revenues aren't there, the reserves aren't there, the buffers aren't there. Now, that places us in a very difficult situation. It's not totally impossible. I mean, some of the recent measures announced, the exchange to borrow from the IMF, the elimination of fuel subsidies, painful as those are necessary structural adjustments that we need to make in order to improve the revenue profile of government. We now have increased transparency in the NNPC. I just read this morning that the NNPC has remitted almost 2 trillion naira to the Federation account, which is much more than it's done in ages. Okay, now 1.2 trillion out of that used to just be petroleum subsidy. Just disappeared. And in addition to the trillions that were going in general administrative expenses between NAPIMS and MPDC and so on, the audited accounts are there for everybody to read the numbers. So just improving the transparency in the oil sector, for example, it has a salutary impact on government revenues. But we also need to look at the quality of spending and make sure that we direct it to the very bottom of the pyramid. How much are we spending on education as a nation? How much are we spending on primary health care as a nation? How much are we spending on nutrition as a nation? How much are we spending on basic things like clean water, rural roads and access to markets as a nation, compared to how much we're spending on beautiful urban bridges, fantastic airports, skyscrapers, and so on. So the whole idea that development is about those people at the grassroots is something we need to keep advocating. And that's what the SDGs are about.
I think it was Amartya Sen, the Indian thinker and economist that wrote a book about development. And he kept on saying...
And development as freedom.
As freedom. And he told a story in that book about how development was justice, how a man had died because there was no access to health care. And that story caught me. And when you put this out there, when you put the human angle to development in general, it really gets to me. It really gets to me because when you think of it critically, it speaks to many things. Take, for instance, it speaks to our current currency situation, our current forex situation, how there's been loss. The current, inventiveness around trying to stabilize it and from issues and things like that. What does this tell you?
I mean, many people just think of economics in terms of statistics and numbers, and this is the worst mistake you can make. Let me explain. Let me give you something from my personal experience. Take the banking industry. When I became governor of Central Bank, I saw a number of banks at the risk of collapse. Now, what historically happened? And it happens all over the capitalist world. I mean, a bank goes on and the management gives all sorts of bad loans, mismanages the bank. You say, well, the bank has collapsed, and you just say this bank has failed, and you liquidate it and give depositors insured depositors some small amount. And that's it. What people don't see, first of all, is that in most banks, the shareholders have like 10, 12% of the money. That is the equity. 90% of the money that banks trade with belongs to other people. It's money deposited. People who put in that money because they believe that that bank is regulated, that there's someone looking at that bank, and that their money is safe and they can go to sleep. It is better to keep that money in the bank than to keep it under their pillow, where it can be stolen or lost or burnt by fire or something. Now, when a bank collapses, nobody thinks of the poor 70-year-old woman in Makurdi selling akara, who has for 20, 30 years been faithfully keeping a savings account and keeping money so that her grandchildren will not suffer. Nobody thinks of the pensioner who spent 35 years working for the government, saved his money, had his pension and gratuity. That is what he has for educating his children and for his medical care. It's gone. People don't think of the human beings behind the numbers. They just say a bank has failed. But with that failed bank, millions have died. But nobody knows them. They were just numbers. And numbers of depositors. How they worked for the money, how they saved it. Maybe they had borrowed money from others, hoping to pay from these savings. Now the savings are gone and they still have to pay off their debt. They may have mortgaged their property to somebody. Children's education, health care. The difference between being able to go for treatment abroad when you are fatally injured or sick and not being able to do it might be that the bank has failed and your money is locked up. So the more we think of who suffers and who benefits from economic outcomes, the more we're able to decide what our priorities are. So one of the key decisions I had to make was, do I allow these banks to fail, which would have been cheaper on the system? Or do I save the banks and then hold the management and the shareholders responsible? The shareholders could lose their money. That's fine. They put in the management anyway. So if you set up a bank, you appoint an MD and management, and that management mismanages your bank, you made that choice. Property. But I felt that the depositors who had put the money in the bank believed that I, as a central bank, was looking at those banks. And I had a moral obligation to protect those depositors. So expensive as that process was, my belief was no matter what it costs, we should make sure that no depositor would lose 1 naira in that bank, because we don't know who the human beings behind those deposits are, what their condition is, what would happen to them if the bank failed. And then we can sort out the issues. And so we removed the management, we prosecuted those whom we could prosecute, okay? We blacklisted those who needed blacklisting. But also we then set up an institution that would recapitalize the banks and then imposed on the banks, all the banks in Nigeria, a levy which would ultimately pay for the bailout over a long term. They didn't like it. It's because they felt, well, look, some banks acted badly, irresponsibly. We managed ourselves well. You're asking us to pay? I said yes, because if we had allowed those banks to fail, all of you would have been affected. Confidence in the industry would have been affected. You would not be standing here. So whether or not, and anyway, next time you see your colleagues misbehaving, you would call them to order because you know that their irresponsibility could come back to you, come back to haunt you. Now, many people thought this was an almost socialist thing, an anti-banking thing, but this is just what you do, what you get when you start thinking of human beings. Okay, now exchange rates. Look, we've become a monocultural economy as far as Forex is concerned. Over 90% of government foreign exchange earnings come from the oil sector. It's one product. And oil is a commodity. Price goes up and down. In addition, we set up the country to suffer. You would, first of all, you fix the price for petroleum products, even though you're not refining your petroleum products. How can you fix the price for a product you do not produce? We produce crude oil, but the price we fixed was for refined petroleum products. So if crude oil price goes up and refined petroleum products go up internationally, we are importing anyway. So we get the benefit of higher crude oil price, and then we lose it immediately because we have to pay more as subsidy for importing refined petroleum products. So we are the only oil producing country that does not see the benefit of rising oil prices. Whenever the price of oil goes up, whatever we get as high oil price, the bulk of it goes back immediately on importing petroleum products and so-called subsidy. So, taking out the subsidy improves. The central bank can only give us stable exchange rates if the central bank has a steady flow of foreign exchange. Now look at the audited accounts of NNPC that have been published 2018, and these are numbers you can check yourself. Take MPDC, which is a production arm of NNPC. It's got over 570 staff, spends over $500 million in general expenses, $900,000 per staff in 2018. NAPEMS has a total annual revenue of just over 5 trillion naira. About 1.2 trillion naira was general expenses. That's 100 billion naira a month as general expenses, over 3 billion naira daily. And that amount is like 25% of total federally collected revenue. Now, the great thing, and we must commend this government, the great thing is that this is the first time NNPC accounts are being audited and published in almost 2 decades. So it's a good first step. Now we need to go and look at those accounts and ask questions and force change so that more and more of that money, which just keeps being drained in this parallel state, gets to the central bank. So the central bank has the foreign exchange reserves to protect the currency. But we also need to continue with the Ministry of Trade has to continue with the support. The central bank now says, you can't import this, you can't import that. The Ministry of Trade needs to work on that. What can we import and what can we not import? And how do we agree with other West African countries on this? The reality is, rice importation doesn't just hurt Nigeria, it hurts all West African countries. West African farmers as a whole. Europe speaks with one voice. West African farmers as a whole would profit from very high tariffs on imported rice from outside West Africa. And then we can produce local rice in Benin, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Niger, okay? And our farmers will get good price for their products, and that's it. And if you want to import rice, well, you pay high price. It will not work if we have a 37% import duty on rice in Nigeria, but there's a 5% duty in Republic of Benin. Now, closure of the borders can only be a temporary solution. We now need to engage our neighbors and agree that all of us in West Africa need to create a situation where we do not import that which we can produce locally. That our farmers are not wiped out by farmers from Thailand and India. That our textiles are not wiped out by textiles from China. So how do we encourage leather production? Look at in Ethiopia. Ethiopia today has a very large leather factory at the industrial park outside Addis Ababa. It is producing shoes for all the great brands in the world. But why do we need to export wet blue and finished leather when we can produce shoes and bags? Why do we need to import shoes from China? We have installations in Aba now for producing shoes. You can have them in Kano. You can have them. We have hides and skin in Kano. Why can't you have a leather industrial park in Aba, a leather industrial park in Kano that produces all the shoes and bags that you need in Nigeria alone, not talk of West African markets, and then have the entire West Africa close off foreign shoes and bags from coming in to produce them locally. I mean, if the brands, international brands, want this market, they can come here, set up an industrial park, use our leather, the same leather that they import and produce in Italy and Spain, will come here, employ labor here, use the leather, produce the shoes here, and sell them. Yeah. So you cannot fix this cycle of devaluation and devaluation and devaluation until you fix the underlying economic fundamentals and reduce your dependence on things that you have to import. I mean, we're an interdependent world. I'm not saying we should start manufacturing airplanes. I'm not saying we should start manufacturing computers immediately. Well, we can. I mean, you've got Xerox, but obviously the things that we're not there yet. What we can't produce locally, we import. But what we have a comparative advantage in, we have the market, we have the labor, we have the raw materials, things like textiles, garments, leather products. Look, even solar panels. Why do you need to import solar panels? What do you need? It's sand.
Silica.
It's silica and sand. It's all over. This is the desert. Look, we are in sub-Saharan Africa. Silica is all over. Silica deposits are all over. Plus some aluminium bars. And that's all you need. And we have the sun in Africa. Produce the solar panels here. Sell them. First of all, you create jobs producing solar panels. Then you produce electricity off-grid. Then that electricity allows people to earn a living, and you create jobs and empowerment. So the multiplier effect of solar panel factories in Nigeria is amazing. And if you take the entire Sahel, northern Nigeria, Niger, Chad, northern Ghana, northern Benin, Mauritania, Mali, all the way to Senegal, the sun is the greatest asset that they have. Yeah. So I think it's about fundamentally rethinking the way we structured our economy and thinking of it in terms of development as opposed to rent seeking. And the key message from Amartya Sen, which you mentioned, is that at the end of the day, look, we talk about all these freedoms. We talk about freedom of speech. We talk about freedom of conscience. We talk about freedom of religion. Okay? We talk about freedom to own property. But how about freedom from illiteracy? Freedom from hunger? Freedom from sickness? Aren't those freedoms? Should you be imprisoned in hunger? Should you be imprisoned in bad health? Should you be imprisoned in malnutrition? Should you be imprisoned in joblessness? Or should you be freed from that? So if we give as much attention, how about if we give as much attention to the rights of a child, the fundamental right of a child to have an education, as we give to the fundamental right of a rich man for his property not to be stolen by a thief, we will not be where we are. And this is how I think we've got to simplify and break down the development story and make it sustainable.
It's still on the development story. a very cardinal point of the SDGs, I mean, it might not be within your purview, will be the advancement of small businesses. They've taken a big hit this COVID period. The CBN tried giving some policies. A lot of people say it's not far-reaching. I mean, what's your take on that? I saw a video recently of a young woman that ran a poultry and was talking about how terrible it's been for her to survive. We've got over 40 million of those kind of people in this country. They're the engine room of this country. How do we help them?
Well, part of what we need to do is to be intelligent about how we approach the management of the economy and the management of the crisis. Okay? Now, the reason SMEs are suffering is because, obviously, of the shutdowns. And these shutdowns have come because of an understandable desire to save lives. And the result, obviously, is that as you save life, you begin to hurt livelihoods. And this debate between saving lives and saving livelihoods is all over the world. I mean, right now you can see all the debates in America as to whether you should open up or whether you should lock down and so on. Now, but there are a number of fundamental points that I think are missing here. First of all, Africa as a whole has shown a relatively low level of mortality compared to the rest of the world. And people can say it's about testing, and testing will show the infections. But the reality is whether or not you test it, if you're dying, you're dying. And we have not seen a sustained elevation in the mortality rates in Africa that would suggest that COVID has impacted on life as much as, say, you would per thousand, as much as, let's say, in Europe or in the United States or in Asia. Now, there are a number of theories that have been advanced, which have not been tested. Some say, look, first, Africa is the youngest continent, and young people are better prepared to cope with COVID than older people. Others say maybe because we've had malaria, we've had all sorts of infections, our immune system is better prepared to deal with and cope with COVID. There's a theory that maybe some variant of this virus, of this coronavirus, which just causes a flu, may have been around Africa for a while.
Yeah.
And therefore, Africa is better able to cope with this new variety. There are people who have even said maybe because we have these compulsory BCG vaccinations for our children, this has helped us cope. And so there are all sorts of stories. Now, what I would like to see is proper scientific research that tells us why fewer Nigerians, for example, are dying from COVID than the rest of the world. Now, if we had this research, and let's say the research came up with the result that it's young people who are surviving. That's the demographics, is the age. Then what does that tell us? It tells us that we can isolate and protect the old, and then open up the economy to the young. And then you don't have to have an either or. So you protect the lives of those who are most vulnerable. We already know that if you have diabetes, you're at risk. We know that if you're old, you're at risk. We know if you have hypertension or asthma, you're at risk. Identify those. Keep them away from people. Let the others out. Now, once people come out, livelihoods are saved, and lives are also saved because you've taken those who are vulnerable. People will always die, people will die, but at the end of the day, you would not have this massive lockdown measure where you're impacting your livelihoods, given how poor our people are. There are people who live from day to day, and by simply not going out. I mean, I'm on the global board of MTN, and we see it. Under COVID, we had a significant increase in our revenue on data because of all these Zoom meetings and companies. But we had a significant fall in voice because people go out, work for the day, they buy airtime out of what they get in the day. If they can't go out and earn a living, they can't even buy airtime, and they can't make calls. So again, it goes back again to looking at the human beings behind these decisions. So while we're trying to save the lives of people from COVID, people might die from hunger.
Yes.
People might die from increased poverty.
Yes.
Now, it is not the fault of the government. The government surely should try to save lives. And surely life is more important than money. However, it doesn't have to be either or. But the way to do it is to do the research, come out with the numbers, to see where are the vulnerabilities. And that's serious intellectual work. Where are the scientists doing the work? The universities are closed. Our universities have been closed since when?
Even before COVID.
Since October?
Yeah.
So where is the research going to happen that will guide the economy? Because this is one time where economic policy depends on research from scientists. It is scientists who will tell us that, look, based on our antibodies tests, based on COVID has been widespread in Nigeria, maybe we've developed herd immunity. However, given our analysis of people who have died, these are the people who have been dead in Nigeria from COVID, and these are the risks. This is the age profile, this is the gender profile, this is the existing precondition profile, and therefore, if you can identify these people and keep them safe, the rest of us can go out and and that is what would help the SMEs get back quickly. You cannot continue giving them loans, because you give them central bank loans, they still have to produce anyway. They have to sell. Otherwise, what will happen? They don't produce, they don't sell, the central bank money becomes a grant. And then it comes back where? It comes back on the balance sheet of the central bank as non-performing loans. Wipes out the capital of the central bank, and the Ministry of Finance has to recapitalize the bank. So there is no solution, no long-term solution to economic activity. No alternative. You have to actually produce goods and services and sell for these SMEs. So it is about fast-tracking that process. You can have temporary measures, central bank financing, government palliatives,
which a lot of people claim is not enough.
To pay salary, yeah, but the government also doesn't have the balance sheet. That is the problem. When you're spending 99% of your revenue on debt service, what is left? 1%. So you can't. I mean, you cannot. I mean, even the economic sustainability plan that they have is like 1% of GDP. Other countries have 3%, 6% of GDP, 10% of GDP. We can't, because where's money going to come from? And people need to understand that the only way the government is going to have money is, one, oil price goes up and they're able to trap those revenues. That's short term. Two, the government borrows. Or three, the government taxes. Now, the government cannot, at this point in time, start increasing taxes on people when they're suffering.
The VAT has gone up 7.5.
Yeah, but that's VAT, and that is painful enough. But imagine now going on to corporate profits taxes, payroll taxes at this time. When you have inflation, exchange rate devaluation, it's simply going to increase suffering. If you think of the economy as three balance sheets, think of a domestic private balance sheet, a domestic public balance sheet, and a foreign balance sheet. Combined, they must balance. If the government is running a huge deficit, that deficit is a surplus somewhere. Now, we know the government is running a huge deficit. We know that the current and capital account, that's the foreign balance sheet, is in deficit. So the surplus is on households and businesses. If you don't borrow, the only way you can deal with those deficits is to reduce the surplus on households and businesses. So, for example, the government can retrench workers. That takes out income from the pockets of households. It also reduces government spending and reduces deficits. Well, who are the human beings involved? If the government says lays off 30% of workers, how many families have you thrown into poverty? Or the government can impose taxes on the private sector, VAT, profits tax on that. But then again, how many people suffer? Are we ready for that at the moment? So we have no choice but to borrow what we can and then have the structural changes that attract investment. And that's what we need. We now need investment. We need local and foreign investment in the productive sector. That's the only way you can offset that deficit.
And that has to be done real quick and real soon.
Yes.
Your Highness, you're going back to school. Happy about it. You've always wanted to do that. You're going to Oxford, you're going on a fellowship, and you'll also be writing. from there. Hopefully, I will be seeing you soon. You're telling a story that, we're talking before we got in here that you said is long overdue. How we handle the crisis. A lot of people have various opinions as regards that. And I'm sure when the book finally comes, a lot of people have various opinions. But for you personally, you learned a lot from that crisis, 2007, 2008. You share some of those lessons. Maybe people, listening now we can take some of those lessons for COVID as a benchmark.
Okay, let me start by saying that ultimately, like everything else, policy needs to rely on the kind of thinking. So maybe many people don't know the background to the steps that we took. When I was approached in February 2009, and when the president met me, and I got a hint that I was being considered as one, not the, but one of a number of possible candidates for governor of Central Bank at the end of May 2009, including the possibility that the serving governor would be renewed anyway, so there was no guarantee. I had to prepare myself in case I was called upon to take on that role, because it was a frightening prospect. The entire world was in a crisis, and if you take over the role of a central bank governor in the middle of a crisis, you have the risk of the whole house crashing on your head, and you're going down in history in ignominy as a shortest lasting governor, and maybe being accused of being the one who brought down the system. I was fortunate at that time to have a friend in Abuja who worked for the British High Commission, who had done her PhD around the Asian financial crisis. And she gave me a copy of that PhD. And there was a comprehensive study of Malaysia and Indonesia, and the role of the IMF, and homegrown models, and how Malaysia, for example, pursued a domestic homegrown model, but one that also met with approval of the international investor community. So it was a hybrid. I mean, you don't have to wait for the IMF to dictate to you, but you've got to do that which every educated economist looking at will say this is something that would work. And so even before I got into the central bank, I had settled on the key issues that Malaysia did, which is basically go in and look at this problem honestly. Do not hide it. Take the steps that need to be taken. And these were drastic, and they would be shocking to many people. But did that? I mean, Malaysia locked up people. Malaysia capitalized banks. Malaysia bought bad loans. Malaysia set up 3 institutions. There was a Dana Harta, there was a Dana Modal, there was a restructuring desk. One of them had the task of basically putting money into the banks just to make sure they had liquidity to keep depositors safe. Another had the task of putting capital into the banks to make sure they had enough capital, and then later, after 5-10 years, would basically sell, after the banks had recovered, would sell that capital and make a profit. Another had the task of taking away the non-performing loans, restructuring them, managing the collateral, and so on. And sometimes selling them to factoring companies. So there'll be a loan of $1 billion. Somebody would buy for 500 million. They'll sell it to them to go and manage with the property and all that, and you cut your losses. Now, what we did with AMCON, that's Management Corporation Nigeria, was to put in all those 3 functions into one company, and this is the first time in the world anybody had done that. But we knew that we needed to do that for the banks. We need to give them life support. We need to give them capital. We need to take care of toxic assets. But the legislative process in Nigeria is such that if we try to pass 3 laws, the banks would have died long before then. So we went through a process of creating one body. And my thought then was, look, after I've left, the next governor or the governor after him might at some point then begin to unpack AMCON into 3 separate entities. Have the toxic assets managed by somebody, have the capital managed by somebody else for value, maybe have the collateral that's been gathered, the real estate of AMCON managed by somebody else. So you could have 2 companies potentially that could be floated on the stock exchange for the central bank to recover some of its money and then government gets out. So you have like a sunset clause. After some time, AMCON would no longer exist as it is because you basically put an end to that. Now, so one of the greatest challenges we had was that there were these big holes in the banks. And how did these big holes emerge? One, we had banking consolidation, where the central bank had required the banks to have capital of 25 billion. Some of these banks decided to set up SPVs, lend money to the SPVs, and then the SPVs turned around and bought shares in the banks. Now, because the money funding the shares came from the banks, all they had done was transfer money from liabilities, depositors' funds, into capital. So we had a bank, for example, that had listed itself at 22 naira or so. The shares were 22 naira at one point. And it owned 25% of itself. By the time the stock market crashed, because you must remember that Nigeria's stock market has a very strong correlation to oil price. Portfolio investors are looking for profits. And what defines for them interest in Nigeria is that they look at the central bank's ability to keep a stable exchange rate and the liquidity in the market. So if the stock market is going up and exchange rate is stable, they make a killing. In 2017, the Nigerian Stock Exchange was the best performing stock exchange in the world in terms of returns. In 2019, it was in 2007. In 2009, it was the worst performing market because oil price had gone to 140 something dollars a barrel, and then it crashed to under $40 a barrel. When oil price crashes, they pull out immediately because even if they don't lose on share price, they would lose on the exchange rate. So basically they come in like a flock of sheep, and then they go out like a flock.
Herd mentality.
Herd mentality, which is why Governor Soludo had these circuit breakers, which I took away because we need to attract foreign exchange, but which obviously, again, you as a central bank governor, you have to take some decisions that may not be ideal, but you're looking at a number of balls you're juggling at the same time. So this is basically what happened. So when oil price crashed and money flew out of the market and the share price of these banks crashed, it was not the shareholders who suffered, but the depositors whose money had been taken to buy the shares of the banks. So it was that breach of trust where somebody had given you money to do normal banking business, but you used his money to make him an unwitting shareholder in your bank. He was a depositor who was lending you money, and you made him a shareholder, taking shareholder risk to go to the capital market. That was the first thing. The second major problem was you then had banks that were tightly controlled by individuals or families, where depositors' funds had been used to create all sorts of loans that were never paid back. So SPVs were set up, loans were given, not just for shares, buying all sorts of real estate in Dubai, in South Africa, in the UK. So you set up a company, somebody would write a proposal and say, this is a company that's doing manufacturing, and you save so many billion, and then just buy dollars with the money and just ship the money abroad. And, so long as you could do commercial paper and borrow from the banking industry, you could cover up. So it was time, if you need money, you issue a CP.
Can imagine.
And then, you just issue a CP 3 billion, 5 billion, other banks just buy that. You get the liquidity, you continue paying your depositors don't know what is happening. But you just have this big hole and keep borrowing from Peter to pay Paul.
I mean, this story is quite amazing, Emir, because and I can't wait for the book to be out. When is the book going to be out? So you can tell, in detail. And you said it's going to be an analytical work. And one other thing, as we wrap up, because time is not our friend, and it's been more than a joy talking to you on and on. Is I see you doing many other things, going back to school, improving capacity, your work with SDG. But let me tell you a very funny story. I think it was during the 40s and 50s when the dismantling of empires started happening in Europe. And there was a young prince, that had to be taken away out of Bulgaria. And in the future, he came back and became democratically elected president of Bulgaria after being a prince as a young 7-year-old. Some people are asking, might that be the case for you? And it's just school or...
No, I don't think. People have been talking to me about politics forever. I mean, when I was in the central bank, 2011, people came to me. They wanted me to be a presidential candidate. I have never had an interest in partisan politics. The nature of my family is that we consider ourselves leaders of all the people, and politics can be very divisive. Yeah. You could just join one political party and then you alienate yourself from others. Although Nigeria is one country where the parties don't seem to enjoy loyalty, it's individuals that enjoy loyalty. All I can say is that this is not something that, for me, is an objective. I think that there are many ways of being of service to the nation. One possibility for me is, if you look at my CV, I started off as an academic. I was teaching economics at ABU. And after just 2 years, before I even completed my master's thesis, I decided to leave and went into banking for some reason. And I've made a success in my career as a banker, as a regulator. I've been an Emir. Maybe it's time. And I suppose I'll write this book in Oxford, and before then I'm publishing my collection of articles. I have a collection of articles that have no relation to economics at all. It's about great. Sharia, society, identity, published somewhere between 1999 and 2005. That book is going to come out in a few months. We've actually completed the selection of the articles, and then the book on the central banking will come out. I still would like to write a book on the impact of certain interpretations of Muslim family law on development in northern Nigeria. So how interpretations of the law and cultural practices around child marriage, around polygyny, around child rights may have inadvertently contributed to the underdevelopment and poverty in northern Nigeria. So that's a third book that I'm going to write. And in the process, I'm thinking maybe I could just use it, or just maybe do a PhD or something, and then maybe go back to that very first career that I never concluded, and just be a professor in different universities abroad. And the great thing with the life I've led is, if I complete that, how many universities would have someone with a PhD who's been a bank CEO, a governor of central bank, Emir. So it's a kind of CV that basically would give you any university in the world, whether it's Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, anywhere you want, because it is now about all your entire life experience and dealing with these issues. So that's one thing that I pursue. Having said that, I don't have an oyster to look at the future, and I'm going to take life as it goes. I'm in no hurry to go into full-time job. I have enough on my plate. I see my life as a life of service. I just don't think that public service is limited to elected office, and any opportunity I have to serve, I will take. If it's service that I think I'm capable of delivering. But no, I have no immediate plans to go into politics now.
All right, Emir, it's been more than exciting talking to you, and your strong passion for Arsenal too is another.
Arsenal won the Community Shield and FA Cup, and they saved me the heartbreak of watching them not play in Europe this year. I hope that this year we'll get to Champions League.
But there's Europe and there's Europe, so there's the Europe and the Champions League. So,
Chelsea fans, you Chelsea fans are just a pain. You're just a pain. Don't worry. We'll bounce back.
All right, thank you so much, Emir. It's been more than a joy, talking to Your Highness and talking about these issues on development, SDG 1 million teachers and many other issues across board. It's been another exclusive right here on the Horizons channel.